Perfect. So I'm very happy to introduce Niki Young. Niki is a lecturer of philosophy at the University of Malta, Junior College. His area of interest include continental philosophy, phenomenology, aesthetic, deconstruction, and also research on new realism. The title of the seminar, today's seminar, is The Notion of Emergence in the Objects-Oriented Ontology. So, Niki, the floor is yours. You have around 45 minutes, and then we will try to open the discussion on your talk.
Thank you, Tiziana. So, as Tiziana rightly said, I shall be talking about the notion of emergence in object-oriented ontology, or more specifically, Graham Harman's specific version of object-oriented ontology, which is object-oriented philosophy. Now, Harman is the founder of this movement called object-oriented ontology, which is precisely a movement dedicated to the investigation of objects, and this term objects is to be understood in a broad sense. I shall share my slides. Okay. Basically, object-oriented ontology is a flat ontology in the sense that it believes that all objects are equally objects, such that there is no a priori distinction and taxonomical hierarchy between different kinds of human or human entities or natural and artificial objects. It is a monism in the sense that it recognizes only one kind of entity, namely objects, but it is also a pluralism in the sense that there are many different kinds of objects. So in this specific philosophy, anything from a peanut, a Maltese citizen, Malta itself, COVID-19, a pot, a pan, a laptop, a pistol, plutonium, and all other such things are in fact objects in this specific sense. Now, when we look at this broad definition of an object, it rightly raises the question, okay, but what exactly is an object within this specific framework? And of course, if objects are emergent entities, which is in fact what Harman suggests, then what does this specific term mean in object-oriented ontology? And this is what I shall focus on today. But in order to answer this question, I shall proceed in the following manner. So first, I shall discuss what the term object means in OOO specifically, and then I shall go on to analyze some of the ways in which objects have been rejected throughout the course of Western thought. Thirdly, I shall focus specifically on the meaning of emergence in object-oriented thought, and finally, I shall discuss Harman's thought on causation, time permitting. Now, I must know that because Harman has in fact no specific explicit theory of emergence, I shall build this theory by referring to other thinkers on the issue, such as Manuel de Landa, for instance. Okay, so if we look at object-oriented ontology, we can see that for this specific movement, objects are the root of all philosophy, as Harman claims. There are, of course, a number of thinkers who have focused on objects throughout the history of Western thought. We can think of, for example, Aristotle, who speaks of mostly natural entities, and Leibniz, who speaks of monads, for instance, or Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, who speaks of an object as the correlate of a conscious act, or Heidegger, who distinguishes between things and objects. And of course, nowadays, we still have people who are interested in objects in the field of, for example, particle physics and whatnot. Now, but in object-oriented ontology, all these specific positions are limited because, for instance, Leibniz, Aristotle, and physicalism recognize solid, simple, or physical entities. So they discount automatically other things which also counted as objects in OOO, such as armies, cities, events, the Dutch East India Company, and so forth. And of course, unlike Heidegger and Husserl, Harman's objects are not the correlate of a the subject. So they are not correlated to the subject. So in the first instance, an object in this specific philosophy, therefore, refers to anything that is ontologically irreducible. That is, it cannot be undermined, that is, reduced to its parts. I shall discuss this specific point later on in more detail. Overmined, reduced to nothing more than its relations, or duomined, namely undermined and overmined at the same time. So, of course, anything counts as an object in OOO as long as it is not exhausted by these kind of anti-object philosophies, as long as it cannot be undermined, reduced to its parts, reduced to its effects, or both simultaneously. Now, of course, the problem is not with undermining and overmining specifically, because they often yield very good results in terms of human knowledge. But the problem is when someone is committed to the ontological claim that things are nothing more than their parts or nothing more than their relations. Additionally, object-oriented ontology also distinguishes between real and sensual objects. Real objects exist in excess of their relations with other entities, as I shall show soon, while sensual objects exist only in the experience of some real object, with the caveat, of course, being that a real object need not be human, even though it includes humans as part of this definition. So for reasons which shall become apparent very soon, I will speak specifically here about real objects and the notion of undermining. So I'm going to look at this concept of undermining in a bit more detail. So undermining is the view that objects are unreal, essentially, because they are a derivative of something deeper than the object itself. There are essentially two forms of undermining. There is a kind of undermining which reduces everything to some root physical elements. We can think of, for example, the ancient philosophers Thales or Anaximander or the atomists, for example, and today we can think of various forms of reductionism and eliminativism. Now, and then there is also a holistic form of undermining which reduces everything to a deeper underlying whole. We can, in this group, we can think of people like Anaximander, for example, the ancient philosopher, or Parmenides, and also more recently, Heidegger, for instance, who sometimes speak of being as that which is deeper than any possible object. Now, Timothy Morton, I think, best explains this idea of undermining, where he defines undermining in his book as the idea that objects are swallowed up by larger objects, and there we have holism, or broken down into smaller objects, and there we have the fundamental units. Now, of course, undermining is sometimes useful. For example, in the classic example, if we show that the morning star and the evening star are really have the same reference, then we have undermined the difference between them. Or if, for example, eventually a theory comes about that would unify relativity and quantum theory, then of course these two separate wings of physics will be undermined. Now, the problem with undermining is threefold. The first problem is that it is a two-layered ontology. A two-layered ontology in the sense that it focuses exclusively on the relation between the fundamental units or the background and the surface. Second, it is also a vertical ontology that in the sense that it focuses on causal relationship between the depth and the surface without considering specific causal relations between individual emergent entities. And of course, the last and most important problem with undermining is that it fails to account for what is known as emergence. Of course, if emergence is not recognized philosophically, then of course only three options would be available, in my view. First, we would either have to conclude that objects do not exist because they are ultimately only their constituent parts. but there we are left with undermining. Or we can say that objects exist only at a level which is of observational scale, which is pertinent to us humans. But in that case, we'd have an overmining in the sense that we've reduced the object down to its relation to an observer. Or finally, we can say that an object is at once both equivalent to its parts and also they exist at a level which is pertinent to human, and in which case we would have a dual-mining position. Now, the fact that Harman criticizes all forms of mining philosophy therefore entails that he must essentially be committed to emergence as an objective fundamental feature of reality. Now, when I say objective here, I mean it in a dual sense. The first sense is, of course, in the sense of pertaining to objects. And in the second sense, I mean it also in the case of being mind independent. Okay, so with this, with these fundamentals out of the way, we can then focus on what emergence means in object-oriented ontology specifically. Now, before I go on to focus on this in more detail, I'd like to point out that Harman essentially gives two definitions of a real object. The first is what I chose to call the negative definition of the object, and this is defined in terms of withdrawal. Basically, what withdrawal means in object-oriented ontology is the idea that given that a real object exists in excess of its relations to other entities, it is not reducible to the sum of its relations, as we see in certain other philosophies, for example, those of Bruno Latour. But on a more positive level, an object may be defined as an emergence. And to quote Harman, he says that an object is real, in his theory, of course, when it unifies its species into an emergent reality that has genuine qualities on its own. So, okay, so here I shall focus on the positive definition of the object as a unified emergent entity, and I shall explain precisely what is generally understood by emergence, and I shall also explain Harman's theory of emergence by taking a detour through the work of Manuel de Landa, who is in some ways close to Harman's own view, in my opinion. Okay, so if we look at emergence, we can distinguish between two aspects of the term. We can look at epistemological or conceptual emergence and ontological emergence. Epistemological emergence can be defined, to quote Humphreys, as follows. Emergent features are the result of the limited abilities of people to predict, to calculate, to observe, and to explain. And of course, relatedly, conceptual emergence is defined as follows. Emergent features are the product of theoretical and linguistic representations of the world. So here we can see that here emergence is defined in terms of our limitations to predict, to calculate, to observe, and so forth. So in terms of human knowledge. On the other hand, ontological emergence means it can be defined as follows. Well, something can be defined as ontologically emergent if it is objectively irreducible, as Manuel de Landa rightly puts it. I shall explain exactly what this means very, very soon. But before I do, I'd like to also point out that emergence has both epistemological and ontological implications. Epistemologically, of course, it has implications for the unity of science, in the sense that if there are truly emergent phenomena, which cannot be deduced, even in principle, from laws, then, of course, we need a new set of laws. And it also has ontological implications, because then we'd have to ask ourselves, what exactly should we be committed to? What kind of entities exist? Are they only the ones which are physically ultimate? So here, this difference between epistemological and ontological emergence has been incorporated by David Chalmers into a distinction between strong and weak emergence. Basically, strong emergence says that well, a high-level phenomenon is strongly emergent if it is not deducible from truths of a low-level domain. Whereas weak emergence is a kind of emergence which is unexpected, but nonetheless deducible in principle from truths from a low-level domain. Examples of weak emergence include, most classically, things like cellular automata, where if you know exactly the position of the particles and the set of laws, you can deduce in principle the movement of these cellular automata. And the same goes for example, the flocking patterns in birds when they migrate. Now, David Chalmers says that if of course strong emergence exists, then it can be used to reject the physicalist picture of the world as fundamentally incomplete, says Chalmers. By contrast, weak emergence can be used to support the physicalist picture of the world by showing how all sorts of phenomena that might seem novel and irreducible at first sight can nevertheless be grounded in underlying simple laws. Now, as some of us may know, Chalmers believes that everything, bar consciousness, of course, logically supervenes on the physical. And therefore, consciousness seems to be the only thing that is, in some sense, a case of strong emergence. Now, if we go back to OOO, Harman would reject this distinction between strong and weak emergent for the simple reason that it is couched in terms of epistemic constraints, and therefore it transforms an ontological reality into an epistemic qualification. Something is emergent as long as it cannot be deduced from our knowledge, basically. So for Harman, like Manuel de Landa, emergence is an ontological feature of the world and is not subject to our epistemic constraints. So as he put it, even if quantum theory lucidly and thoroughly explains the behavior of chemical elements in the periodic table, it doesn't follow that these elements can be eliminated in favor of a microphysical discussion of quarks and electrons. So here we can see that for Harman, predictability does not bear on the ontological reality of the thing, because, like many other thinkers, for example, Maurizio Ferraris is one of them, he separates the realm of the epistemological from that of the ontological. We can't reduce an ontological reality into an epistemic qualification. So for Harman, objects emerge at countless different levels of reality. So okay, now I shall look more deeply into Harman's philosophy on emergence by taking a detour into Manuel de Landa's criteria for emergent entities, as stated in his book, A New Philosophy of Society. So Manuel de Landa calls emergent entities assemblages. And he selects 4 criteria for something to be a real assemblage, as opposed to a random aggregate of parts. The first criteria is that an emergent entity has emergent properties. Namely, it has properties not possessed by its parts. So in this case, for example, the Dutch East India Company as a whole would be a case of an emergent entity because it has properties which are not possessed by the individual ships, merchants, and so forth. Of course, Malta would also be a case of emergent properties because it has properties not possessed by the sum of the individual citizens or by any particular individual citizen. Of course, an example of this would also be water because it has emergent properties not possessed by the sum of its constituent parts. So, as Harman says, There are effects of surprise and novelty at every possible level, not just at the single magical gap between microparticles and consequences and consciousness. Sorry. Now, of course, Delanda, who also advocates a flat ontology like Harman, in fact, he says that assemblages at different levels have causal autonomy. Now, a second criteria for an emergent entity would be downward causation, or the idea that an entity has a retroactive effect on its parts. Now, reductionism champions a bottom-up approach. But the idea of downward causation is that the whole can have effects, retroactive effects on its parts. The classic example would be this. For example, if an organism is looking for food, say, the organism as a whole is causing its parts to do what they do, and not vice versa. Now, or maybe also vice versa. The third criteria for an emergent entity would be redundant causation. Redundant causation, simply put, is the idea that many parts can, once an emergent entity occurs, many parts can be added, removed, or replaced without impacting the whole within limits, of course. So, and of course, we can also see that sometimes it just so happens that different causes can produce the same effects. And similarly, we can imagine the same object to be composed of entirely different entities. Now, the last criteria for an emergent entity, which Delanda lists, is that that an emergent entity can generate new parts. So emergent wholes can often create new parts. For example, that once the Dutch East India Company, say, emerges as a social entity, it can generate new entities, such as trade outposts, fleets, coinage, and so forth. Now, if we go back to Harman, who is the subject of our discussion, well, he would agree that these four criteria are, in fact, good and useful criteria for our account of what an emergent entity is. But at the same time, he believes that they are, in some sense, also limited. They are limited in the sense that it focuses a lot on the relation between an assemblage and its parts rather than the assemblage and the larger world outside it. And of course, Harman would say that this definition of emergence leans a bit too much into overmining insofar as it focuses too much on what an entity or what an assemblage does rather than what it is. So Harman prefers to say that these criteria are symptoms that an object is present rather than being the conditions of possibility of an object. So with that in view, we may ask ourselves more directly, what is Harman's specific view of emergence? Well, the definition of emergence is this idea that there is a grouping of entities together such that they form, I quote, a larger compound entity per se, which is ontologically distinct from its parts and ontologically reducible to them as well. So we may think of, for example, a pen as an emergent entity, but we can also think of a city, for example, the city of Turin, as an emergent entity, or the University of Turin might also be an emergent entity, as well as, in this specific definition, something like a protest, for instance, or even an event, a car crash, would be considered an emergent entity in its own right. Or we can also mention, for example, a marriage. Now, every object for Harman emerges out of its parts, and all objects have parts. But it is nonetheless irreducible to those parts because redundant causation shows that the object's history and its parts are, to a large extent, irrelevant to the object as a whole. Now, for Harman, every real emergent entity is a monad, it is a unit. and it unifies its species in order to generate new qualities. But given that the object is emergent, it cannot be equivalent to its qualities, which it can manifest, but at the same time is not equivalent to. Now, Harman agrees that all entities are composite, so they are made of smaller entities, but it doesn't follow from that the smallest entities are in fact the only things that are real. So for Harman, there is in some sense an infinite regress of objects. There are objects which are in turn made up of objects and so forth. So that every object is a substance in the sense that it unifies its pieces into an emergent entity, but at the same time, it is itself made up of a complex of relations between other objects. Because now, Harman would say that if things are reducible to their parts, their very bottom layer, they cannot explain how things relatively endure while its parts are replaced and so forth. So a thing is not just an aggregate for Harman, but a sum total of parts, such that, in a sense, the whole is always more than the sum of its parts, but also less than the sum of its parts, because it doesn't manifest the sum total of all the qualities of its parts at one go. Now, Harman's view of emergence necessitates a discussion on the topic of vicarious causation. Now, vicarious causation is a specific model of causation developed within OOO, Harman's version of OOO especially, in order to explain how entities interact. And this is an especially important problem in OOO, well, because essentially an entity always emerges into a unified whole out of the interaction between parts. But, and here's the important caveat, if every entity is made up of a set of relations, Harman says that the inverse also follows, in the sense that every relation also counts as a new emergent entity. So this particular idea broadens the definition of an object in such a way that, for example, even an event such as a plane crash, for example, would need to be understood as a new object, a new emergent entity in its own right. But Harman says that entities also cannot be identified with their relations, so that things do not relate a priori. Relations are not a given. They, to use a word which was especially common in the earlier works of OOO, but not as much now, entities withdraw from one another, such that it might be questioned how they would relate at all, as in how emergent entities would come about to begin with. Because if entities are by definition separate and cannot relate directly, then the question would be, how does emergence work? How do entities combine into new emergent entities by virtue of their interactions, by virtue of interactions between parts? Well, the answer that Harman gives is that entities cannot relate directly. For example, in this diagram here, we have a real object 1 and a real object 2. These two objects cannot, by definition, interact directly. But they can, however, interact indirectly by virtue of translations which one object grasps of another. So in some sense, a real object 2 in this diagram interacts with the real object 1, not directly, but by virtue of the translation, the sensual image, so to speak, which it grasps of that object. Now, if we look at Harman's notion, therefore, we can see that causation and interaction more broadly must always happen indirectly, or by virtue of mediation. And it is for this reason that Harman calls this vicarious causation. Now, Harman lists essentially 3 features of vicarious causation, in his model. He says that causation is always vicarious, buffered, and asymmetrical. But I propose to broaden, in fact, this list, because I believe that within his specific philosophy, causation must also necessarily be binary, alluring, and aesthetic in a very specific sense. So I shall briefly look into each of these particular features of causation in Harman's philosophy in order to explain how things interact to begin with in OOO, and therefore how emergence is possible to begin with. Well, the first quality, vicariousness, implies that causation cannot be direct. By definition, since 2 objects always withdraw from one another, they are separate from one another such that they cannot interact directly, then causation can only be indirect. It occurs via the mediation of a vicar or intermediary. This intermediary being the translation which one object grasps of another. Harman often calls this translation the sensual. Now, to say that causality is buffered means that objects, of course, do not interact directly, as I've already said, but they only occur via these sensual translations, such that this realm, let's call it the realm of the sensual, these translations prevent objects from directly fusing into one another, into an undistinguished whole. So even when 2 objects interact, for example, to form a new emergent entity, this new emergent entity is unified, but at the same time, the objects of which it is composed do not fuse into one another and are therefore, to a very large extent, separable from the new emergent whole. Now, causation in object-oriented ontology is asymmetrical in 2 related ways, actually. The first sense is in the aforementioned sense that a real object originally interacts with the sensual mediator rather than the real one directly. And of course, it is also asymmetrical in the sense that if 2 objects are seen to mutually affect one another, in actual fact, this is not the result of a mutual interaction, but of 2 one-way relations between them. So say, for example, if 2 real objects interact, in the case of, say, for example, 2 cars crashing into one another, the notion of vicarious causation claims that car A forms a connection with B and B forms the connection with A, but not both simultaneously. They are 2 one-way relations. Now, for Harman, causation is also binary. It is binary in the sense that interactions for Harman occur exclusively between 2 and only 2 objects. Now, this does not mean that in actual fact, only 2 objects ever interact, but rather it means that only 2 objects interact at one go. So in the case where more than 2 objects are involved, of course, there is either a slow accretion of parts of terms, of pairs of terms, or a central term that relates independently with each of the other 2 entities, for example. Now, the fifth criterion for vicarious causation is that causation is always, in OOO, alluring. Alluring in the sense of both to allude, in the sense of referring, and in the sense of attracting. So we can say that causation is alluring in the sense of to allude, because since causation is vicarious, then of course the sensual mediator, the translation of the object, alludes to an underlying or refers indirectly to an underlying real object. But it is also alluring in the sense of to draw towards, because in the case of causation, the real object summons another real object towards it, so to speak, via this sensual mediator. Now, lastly, Harman speaks of vicarious causation as aesthetic. It is aesthetic, once again, in two very distinct senses, in two interrelated senses. First of all, it is aesthetic in the sense that Harman confers the source of all causal impetus towards the sensual surfaces of things. Now, so the sensual is not simply a realm where an object, so to speak, experiences another, but also the beginning of a causal connection between two entities. So in Harman's philosophy, the aesthetic it has a very important causal role. Lastly, causation is also aesthetic in OOO in the sense that he identifies causation with an aesthetic effect, in the sense that when this causal relation occurs, an object, a sensual object is broken away from its qualities, and these qualities are in turn used in order to connect, to create an emergent entity, which then has retroactive effects on the parts. Now, so in order to conclude this this talk on Harman's theory of emergence, we can therefore see that that if we want to speak of realism, we ought to accept emergence as an ontological feature of reality, one that happens on all levels of reality and not just the physically ultimate. So for Harman, emergence is an ontological feature of reality, such that the object is always already more than the sum of its parts, in the sense that the emergent object is not just an aggregate of all its parts, but it rather unifies these parts into an emergent whole. And secondly, an object which is emergent is also in some sense less than the sum of its parts, because there is a sense in which the emergent entity does not express all the qualities of its parts, but rather it selectively expresses such qualities. Okay, that concludes my my talk on Harman's view of emergence, and I think I'm in good time and can therefore take questions or comments. Thanks.
Okay, here we are. Thank you, Niki, for your very brilliant and inspiring talk.